Hey everybody, we are going to talk about Pinterest. It's one of my biggest stock positions and it just reported earnings. The stock reacted very favorably. It's up by about 20% as I'm speaking, roughly a day after the earnings report. And we're going to take a look at the numbers. Before we do, take a minute and click subscribe if you haven't to my channel already, and check out the link you see on your screen, fool.com/Frankel. You can get the top 10 stocks to buy right now from the Motley Fool. It's the best way to support this work I'm doing on YouTube. Again, that is fool.com/Frankel. So let's dive right into it. I'm going to share my screen. All right, so we'll start with just revenue. Revenue was a big surprise this quarter. Now, you might notice that that's kind of a low revenue bar for the first quarter compared to the last few, and that's generally due to seasonal weakness. Remember, Pinterest makes most of its money on advertising, and advertisers tend to spend the most money toward the latter months of the year in preparation for the holidays and pull back a little bit on spending in the first quarter. It's to be expected. This was way higher than analysts were projecting. Pinterest generated about $740 million in revenue in the quarter, as you can see there. That was a 23% jump from the first quarter of last year. And for comparison, the median expectation among analysts was 700 million. So Pinterest beat estimates by about $40 million. Not too bad at all. If you see the colors of the bars in those charts, you'll notice that most of Pinterest revenue still comes from its North American users. In US and Canada, that accounts for about 80% of its total revenue. That's the blue bar that you see in the chart right over here. So revenue was good. All revenue growth was good all around the world. It was, between 22 and 27% in every region that Pinterest operates in. Great revenue growth, and it was an acceleration. That 23% growth rate that you see was the highest it's been since 2021, actually, when the pandemic tailwinds were still kind of growing Pinterest's user engagement for it. So great on the revenue side. Let's get to the monthly active user side. Again, biggest jump since 2021. Pinterest added 20 million users during this last quarter alone. Now has 518 million monthly active users. The first time it's surpassed that half billion mark. The biggest growth was from outside of the US, which could be significant for future revenue growth, as I'll talk about on the next slide. But great user growth, 518 million, as I mentioned. The expectation from analysts was 505 million. So that was a big beat on user growth. You can see U.S. user base grew by 3% year over year. That's okay. But outside of the U.S., the revenue or the user base was especially fast growing. That's 16% in the rest of the world. That's essentially everything except North America and Europe. That's where the bulk of the growth came from. And that is significant because of Pinterest's average revenue per user. You can definitely see the seasonality when you're comparing the fourth quarter of 2023 to the first quarter. Even though the first quarter was ahead of expectations, it's still a big drop off from the seasonally strong fourth quarter. So you're seeing seasonal weakness apparent throughout this report, and that's okay. Big difference to notice between the US and Canada, which are the dark blue bars here, and everything else. Europe is, generating some revenue for Pinterest, not a lot, but it's at least something. For the rest of the world, everything outside of the US and Europe, it's pennies. 11 cents per average user in the rest of the world, $6.05 per average user in the US and Canada. That's literally a 55 or so times the amount that the average non-US or Europe user is generating. So management knows that is a problem. The US between US and Canada, that's roughly 20% of Pinterest users. They're not doing a great job of monetizing internationally. So CEO Bill Reddy said, we see Pinterest as significantly under monetized across the board, including the US, but the most under monetized internationally. Now, to be clear, this gap is never going to completely close. If you look at the numbers from Meta's Facebook advertising revenue, you'll see the rest, outside of the US, the monetization is significantly lower, but it's not pennies like we're seeing with Pinterest. And again, the outside of the US makes up about 80% of Pinterest user base, but only about 20% of its revenue right now. So that's something that management and investors would like to see change over the next few years. So, one more slide before we kind of just talk about what we're watching going forward. So, this is Pinterest adjusted EBITDA. Probably the best metric of how much the company is actually making right now. Its bottom line earnings include things like stock-based compensation and a bunch of other items that aren't actually costs, but should definitely be considered, but aren't the best indicator of how much money the company's actually bringing in. You can see the seasonal weakness again in the adjusted EBITDA margin, going from 37% in the fourth quarter to 15% in the first. Again, that's seasonal weakness. That's nothing to be alarmed about. The simple version is Pinterest is bringing in a lot more advertising revenue in the fourth quarter, but its expenses are relatively consistent quarter to quarter to quarter, which is why you see the margins contracting. But compare it to the first quarter of 2023, and there's no comparison. Adjusted EBITDA roughly more than quadrupled over the past year. So really impressive numbers there. So let me go ahead and stop sharing real quick. And a couple things to note other than that. So Pinterest also issued second quarter guidance. And because of the seasonality thing I mentioned, it is supposed to be significantly higher than the first quarter. They're guiding for $835 to $850 million in revenue in the second quarter. Analysts had been expecting 827, so this is a significant upgrade of guidance. That would translate to about 18 to 20% year-over-year revenue growth in the second quarter. And Pinterest beat its first quarter guidance, so who's to say it won't do that in the second quarter? They're thinking the good times are going to continue. The new partnerships in e-commerce that they're doing are really paying off. So is Pinterest still a buy? Now, I probably won't add to my Pinterest position if I'm being totally honest, just because actually after this 20% rise, Pinterest is now the biggest stock in my portfolio. Not by a giant margin, but it is my largest investment. So it's at a comfortable size for me right now. I'm probably not going to add at these levels. Having said that, I think we could just be, there could be a lot more upside to grow. If Pinterest keeps maximizing its e-commerce potential, I could see it getting to 1 billion active users worldwide within the next 5 years or so. I think that would be a very achievable target, especially considering some of the user bases of other social media platforms. There's a ton of opportunity to monetize that international user base. If it can just bridge the gap a little bit, it would be huge for bottom line earnings right there. There's a lot of potential in e-commerce. The new CEO is still relatively new in his role, Bill Reddy, who came from Google and is still really exploring all of the possibilities with e-commerce. And Pinterest trades for about 30 times forward earnings right now, which might sound expensive at first, but with an 18 to 20% growth rate projected, and so much untapped monetization potential across its entire user base, that could end up being a pretty cheap valuation if you're looking back in a few years from now. So I'm holding strong. I'm not going to sell any of my Pinterest stock, even though it's become my largest position. It still looks like an attractive company, and this was an absolute blowout quarter, and I couldn't be happier with how the new management team is doing. I want to thank The Motley Fool for sponsoring this video. The Motley Fool is a company that provides investing insight and stock recommendations for investors of all skill sets and risk levels. You all know how much I love researching new stocks and trying to find the next best investment, so I'm proud to partner with The Motley Fool to bring you 10 stock picks from their popular product, Stock Advisor. Stock Advisor has beaten the market by more than 4 times, so go to fool.com/Frankel to get your 10 stock picks now. The Motley Fool Stock Advisor returns are 650% as of April 16th, 2024, and are measured against the S&P 500 returns of 148% as of April 16th, 2024.